and I'm very happy to start this webinar tonight. So that's a great pleasure to welcome Casper and Jesper for presenting their paper. So the impact of competition for public contracts on public finances. To be frank with you, I decided alone to invite them because I discovered this paper that has been put online a few weeks ago. And I thought the topic and the data were very interesting, and also the result of the paper was very interesting. And so that's a pleasure to welcome you for this presentation. The rules of the game. So everything is recorded during your presentation. You've got 20 to 25 minutes to present, and there is the opportunity for people that are connected to ask questions, just clarifying questions. And then we will stop recording and we will go to the question time. And we've got 1 hour and 10 minutes, no more, for the whole presentation and the discussion part. Okay, thank you very much. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good evening. Thank you for inviting Casper and me to present our little analysis here. We both work at the Danish Competition and Consumer Authority, and let's just give a very brief presentation of ourselves to begin with. Casper?
Yes, good evening, and hello everyone. So my name is Casper Aagaard, and I'm an economist in our public procurement office in the Danish Competition and Consumer Authority. And in a brief, short time, I'll be presenting the analysis that you referred to, Stefan.
Yeah, Casper is actually the one who has worked really hard with the data and handled the technical aspects of this analysis. I'm Jesper Lino, and I'm a Deputy Director General, and also I'm a part-time associate professor at the University of Copenhagen Department of Economics. But before Casper is given the word to give this presentation, I'll try to give a little inflying, a little introduction of this, because why is this subject really interesting? For us personally, it's of course interesting because we are responsible for the procurement area in Denmark. That means that we work with the Danish Procurement Act, we advise public contracting authorities in this field, we develop guidelines, and we generally take an analytical approach to these things. And as you all know, there's been a lot of focus on the public procurement in recent years that goes in Denmark, but as you know, also across Europe. And now we are standing in front of a reopening of the European procurement directives. So it's pretty exciting times in this matter. But it's, of course, not just interesting for us who are looking into this field, because it's actually a subject that is pretty important for everybody in our society. Because on one hand, these procurement procedures, they can be perceived as being complicated, and it is often said that they lead to high transaction costs and that they are time-consuming processes. And that is actually a story that is not very hard to tell. But there are so many benefits that goes along with these efforts. And in this paper, we aim to demonstrate that there are many good reasons for public contracting authorities to try and conduct as well-designed procurement processes as possible, because they foster competition for these assignments, and this leads to lower prices for the public sector. And with a significant amount of uncertainty, of course, we also offer some estimates on the amount of savings that the public sector can achieve through these procurement measures. And we believe, and we also hope that you do when we are done, that we provide some convincing evidence that the benefits can be actually quite significant. Trying to put a little Danish angle on this, I can say that in Denmark many years we've had a focus on trying to provide reforms that increase labor supply. And we've also, but maybe to a lesser extent, had focus on reforms that also increase productivity. And if the goal is to increase national income, both channels are effective, but they differ in at least one important dimension. And that is that when it comes to labor supply reforms, it contributes to expanding what is called fiscal space. It increases fiscal sustainability. Productivity gains, they do not have the same effect, and that is because although that productivity increases our overall income, it is so that in Denmark, that almost all expenditures in the public sector are linked to income as well. And that means that when income goes up, when tax revenues go up in the public sector, so does the expenditures. And therefore, although we get richer, fiscal space is not expanded when productivity is. And the interesting thing about these public procurement efforts is that it actually contributes to a little bit of both. It increases productivity in the public sector. It has some positive spillover effects to the private sector, so it also increases productivity in the private sector. And on top of that, it is also so that because the public sector is able to buy cheaper, it also expands fiscal space. So therefore, it supports fiscal sustainability, so to say. To round off, this is the first time that we do a presentation of this paper in an academic setting, and therefore we are a little bit excited, looking forward to all your comments. So we're really looking forward to get some feedback from you that might help us improve the paper. One of the things that is impossible to leave aside is, of course, the question of causality. We try to address it, but as you all know, it's not always completely easy. If you think we got something wrong, of course, tell us. You will do that. I am sure about that. If we should control for further factors, try and encourage us to that. And if we haven't done enough looking into the existing literature, do tell us as well. Come up with everything, we can use it. So that was my little brief introduction, and I will give the word to Kasper once I have been able to put the presentation up so you can all see it. So I'm sharing it now. Let's look at this. Can you all see the presentation now? That's great.
Okay.
Yes. Perfectly well.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Jesper. And as Jesper said, all questions and comments, we welcome them. So keep that in mind when you hear me speak for the next 20 minutes or so. And thank you, Stefania, for the invitation. It's very exciting to present our results here in this group. I have a brief presentation that you said that you can see. So I'll be talking from that, but let's see. The first picture is where we are, and as Jesper said, we're the Danish Competition and Consumer Authority, and well, we work for well-functioning markets, and this also accounts for the markets of public procurement. Aha. So let's dive right into it, and this is what I'll be talking about today. Let me start by saying that I'm obviously not a native English speaker. So if anything is unclear or if I'm talking complete nonsense, please just ask me to clarify. I won't take it personally. It's all good. We shouldn't let a language barrier hinder this presentation, but I promise I'll do my very best to be as fluent as possible in English. And this is what we're going to talk about today. I'll put a few more words as to why this topic is interesting. Then we'll discuss results and conclusions, and then I hope for a lively discussion afterwards. So, to add to Jesper's very good argument on why this topic is so interesting, let me just start by saying that the area of public procurement is huge. And I think we know this in this forum, but maybe it's not top of mind for everyone. In Denmark, public procurement accounts for approximately 16% of GDP, which is more than 60 billion euros. And that number is so big that I basically don't understand it. But 16.2% of GDP, I understand that. And in across Europe, it's about the same. And in France, it's also a similar share of GDP. So I can understand that you in this very forum had a visit from the European Court of Auditors. So I won't dwell too much on their analysis, but I'll just briefly mention that their conclusion is that the competition is declining. And this is just to share their result, another view to look at the result. And I won't say too much about that, especially because you've had them talking, which is more firsthand. But the one thing I will say is that the dots, they are countries, and a dot above this line means that the country had more single bids in 2021 than they did 10 years previously in 2011. So, and this applies to most of the countries in the EU. So their conclusion is competition is diminishing. When we dive a little further into the Danish data on these single bids, that's the first thing we're talking about when we're talking competition in public procurement. This slide shows the share of public procurement contracts that received a single bid in the current year. And a single bid is here a public procurement contract that only received one bid. Okay, so the graph shows some variations between the years and potentially a slight tendency towards an increase. But we don't see the very aggressive increase in this estimate as the ECA sees. And why is that? Now, the ECA concluded that the competition might be diminishing, but they also concluded that the monitoring and subsequently the data quality on competition in public procurement might leave something to be desired. Okay, so this is based on our data, which originated from Tenders Electronic Daily, TED, but we've made some corrections and enrichments to this data. And that's why our data is not always one-to-one the same as the data you can extract from TED. All right, let's move on and talk a little about the analysis. And we'll dive right into it. This analysis focuses solely on Danish tenders. And this is just a picture of the Danish article. And as you can see, it's a picture of an auction. And why is that? That's because when I say public procurement in this specific setting, I'm thinking of an auction-like setting. So the public wants to buy something, and then private suppliers, they make a bid for solving this problem. Okay, and then they can win the contract based on who offered the best bid. Our analysis, as you said, Stefania, is called the impact of competition for public contracts on public finances. And what we investigate is basically the relationship between the number of bidders and the price paid by contracting authorities in Danish EU tenders. Our hypothesis is basically that an increase in the number of bidders leads to a decrease in price. And I can tell you already that we find a relationship here that an increase in bidders leads to a decrease in price. Okay, so before we dive into the results, I'll talk a little about the descriptive data. This is the distribution of number of received bids. On the x-axis, we have the number of received bids, and then we have the share of tenders with the number of bidders on the y-axis. For example, we see Danish tenders most often receives 3 bids, almost as often they receive 2 bids, whereas only approximately 10% of bidders received 6 or more bids. Okay. So the number of bids and contract value. And now I'll introduce our term for price when we talk about price on public contracts. So it's P over PE. And what does this mean? This means that we have a price that is P, and then we normalize it with the expected price. And in this context, the expected price is the price that the contracting authority initially expected to pay. So this is the initially expected price. And if the final price when agreeing to the contract is the same as the contracting authority agreed upon, initially thought, then this would be 1. Okay, and let's see the distribution of this price term across tenders with different number of bidders. So the only one that's above 1 is all the tenders with only 1 bid. And this is an average for all our observations with X number of bidders. And we see, as we have stated in the slide, we see a strong correlation. More bidders means lower prices. And let me emphasize that this is just the descriptive statistics. So we have not yet taken the control variables into the mix. Okay, another way to look at this price is, okay, we're interested in price reduction, but what if we are more interested in just not having a very expensive price? So we've divided the tenders in our dataset into tenders that had a non-expensive winning bid and tenders with an expensive winning bid. And here, expensive is just defined as a winning bid that's 20% more costly than the initial expectations. And we also see what one might expect, that the more bids we receive, the fewer tenders are left with a winning expensive bid. Okay, I'll move on also in the interest of keeping the time. So let's talk a little about our estimated model. And if you're not an analyst, this is a horrible slide, but I think it's nice to have some visuals to explain what is going on when we estimate the model. On the left-hand side, we have this price term that I briefly touched upon earlier, with the price normalized with the expected price. And then on the right-hand side, well, we have a vector of control variables that is multiple variables. It could be the type of contract. Is it a works contract? Is it services? Is it appliances? Or what type of contract is this? Then it could be the type of contracting authority. Is it the state or is it some municipality? It could be, where is it? A geographical region in Denmark. Again, it's Danish data. And then we get to the interesting part, and these measure the number of bidders. And this, in this model specification, we've put in some dummy variables that takes the value of 1 if the number of bid is that current value. So there will be 2 in the first term here and 3 in the second term. And the dummy variable is 0 otherwise. That gives us an estimate of the differences in price compared to when only receiving 1 bit. Okay, and these are the results for the coefficients for said dummy variables. So, and let me just say, if you only remember one slide from today's presentation, I wanted to read this slide because this is our main result as stated in the headline. The tender, if a tender receives 2 bits instead of 1, the expected price or the price term is 4.6% lower, which is what we see in the far left of the figure. Let me also just say that the thin black lines, they are 95% confidence intervals. So as long as the line doesn't cross the x-axis, then the result is statistically significantly different from 0. And let me emphasize that 2 things comes to mind when you see this graph. First of all, that the more bits, the lower the price. This is in accordance with our hypothesis and the result we would expect. And secondly, another interesting thing is that there seems to be diminishing returns. So the effect from going from 1 bit being the reference point, to 2 bits is 4.6%. That's a bigger difference than going from, say, 4 bits to 5 bits. Okay, so that was the main result and the key finding. But as I touched upon earlier, we need to have a discussion about the data, and then we need to have a discussion about the methods. And I'll try to keep it short in the interest of keeping time, but there are some things that are important to mention. Let's first talk about the data. Now, the data originates from Tender's Electronic Daily, TED, as I previously said. But we've also made significant efforts on performing some data corrections on obvious errors or missing data. Okay, what do I mean when I say that? I brought with me some examples. Data corrections could be that in TED, there's simply no contract award notice. It doesn't exist. And that would mean in our setup that the data is just gone. So that's not good. Another typical problem we encountered is that there were missing values. There were a lot of information that weren't filled out or were obviously wrongly filled out. And that's even worse than if they're missing, because then we have an information that is simply untrue. And now I've said on the slide, semi-automated data correction. So we've had a script to identify a lot of these problems, but the solution, part of the solution is also more manually driven. So basically we've also, when there was a missing contract award notice, we've picked up the phone and called the contracting authority and said, hey, maybe you need to fill out some stuff, or is it on the way or something? And then there might come a contract award notice soon thereafter. Okay, let's move on. And if you'll notice on this slide, it's the same text, but now with the word model highlighted instead. It's nice with the visual aid in that sense. I'll talk a little about the model. So I've presented it, and it's a fairly simple model. In order to address some potential challenges in this analysis, we've accompanied this model with a variety of alternative specifications. And I've listed some of the alternative specifications here, and I'll very briefly take you through each of these. Okay, the first thing are the different types of tenders. So here's the graph. And as I mentioned earlier, the thin black lines are 95% confidence intervals. So we see significant results across the line. None of the thin black lines cross the x-axis. And the main result here is that competition effect on price is significant, no matter which type of tender you look into. And I also briefly want to mention that we're now using another model than the one presented earlier with the dummies. Now the number of bidders is presented with one numerical variable that counts the number of bidders. So the estimation here is the average effect, the coefficient for the slope, when we have all the different values of bidders in one variable. Okay.
Using the stipulates, but then letting go of them, and then seeing if it catches the truth.
I'm sorry?
We had a little hard hearing you. Can you speak up a little?
Okay, just switch off the mic of somebody. Don't worry. Go on.
Okay. I thought it was a question, but I couldn't hear. Okay. So we'll be moving on. Alternative specification number 2, restricted procedures. Now, this is a graph that looks like the first graph I presented. But the difference here is that we've only estimated the model on restricted tenders. Restricted tenders are procedures where the contracting authority sets a maximum of the number of bids they want to receive. And then they select the relevant bidders based on defined and communicated pre-qualification criteria. That is to say, the tender can have a maximum of, say, 5 bids. What is the idea behind this? That is to account for the possible effect of our price term actually affecting the number of bidders, having a reverse causality in that area. By estimating the model on restricted tenders only, we've put a limit on how much the number of bidders can be affected by the price term. I mean, the number of bidders can't go beyond 5, right? It doesn't have to be 5, that's just an example, but there is a maximum of the number of bids allowed to get into this procedure. And as you can see from the diagram, we get pretty much the same results as we did when we looked at a similar diagram earlier. However, the significance is not the same. And why is this? This is because our pool of data does not include that many restricted tenders, or at least that's a part of the explanation. So there's higher variance, basically. Okay. Another concern one might have is the expected price. Now, the expected price is based on the contracting authority's initial expectations. And how do they decide what their initial expectations are? So we were thinking about, is there some systematic bias or variation in this variable, which would bode ill for our analysis? So what we tried to do is come up with a fixed effects specification. And fixed effects basically controls for contracting authority specific effects that are invariant over time. So if one specific contracting authority systematically put down a very low or very high expected value, then that would be accounted for in this model. And we find similar results with this fixed effects specification. Okay, this is not really an alternative specification, but more an overview of existing literature on the topic, which we found useful navigating our own analysis. And there's a lot of information here, and you don't have to look into all of it in detail. I'll just briefly highlight what is expressed in these two columns. Now, in the very first column is the name of the paper, and some of these papers might be more familiar to some of you than others, and maybe more familiar to some of you. So the two columns in the box. The first column is the estimated effect when there is no accommodation of this simultaneity bias, that the price might affect the bidders, or that the bidders might be endogenous. Those are some difficult words, but hopefully you understand what I mean. That was the first column. The second column is instead when the authors try to account for the number of bidders might be decided in the model, which is something you don't want when you want to analyze causality, right? So what comes to mind is that the estimation results in the second column is typically larger than those in the first column. And what does this mean? This means that we estimate a bigger effect when we control for the number of bidders might be endogenous. Okay. Yes, Jesper?
Can I add just a little bit here? The relevance of this one is because that, of course, we are concerned about endogeneity in our regressions here. And that means that we're trying to communicate a story which we also believe in, and theory tells us it should be like that, that the effect goes from price to from the number of bidders to price reductions. And we try and do everything we can in order to try and see if we can get a hold on this simultaneity bias that might arise if things also work the other way around. We've tried to control a little bit for that, but it's obviously one of the things that we would like to hear from you, if you can come up with any good instruments or other procedures in order to help us make this part more convincing. But the point with this table is basically that others in literature has tried and struggled with the same kinds of problems. And when they try to correct for this, they do not get lower effects from the number of bidders or the measure of competition into to prices. That's basically what we try to show here. So sorry, Kasper.
No, that's perfect. Very well explained, if I might say so. And obviously, as Jesper said, we welcome comments and suggestions on this area. I'll just finish up, and then we can open the floor for a debate, I think, Stefania, if that's okay with time.
1 minute to conclude.
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so I just want to summarize the insights we've discussed today, that public procurement, the area is huge, and it accounts for a large portion of public finances. And we see that the level of competition has a significant impact on prices in public procurement. This is the main result that we've talked about today. Also, we talked a little about the level of competition might be declining, which is then bad news. So I have another box that's called implications. And these insights obviously lead to some thoughts. And one of those is that awareness of these insights might prove important when we discuss the future of public procurement, which is a very hot topic these days. And we talked a little about that in the beginning of this meeting. And then I just want to mention the fact that we obviously realize that there are numerous other considerations other than price reductions, even though it's price reductions we focus on this study. But yeah, I've listed some of them in the text on the slide. But when we are talking about using public procurement to achieve goals, I think it's important to enter that discussions with open eyes. And I think that is the word I want to leave you with. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I propose now to move to the question part of the webinar. We will stop recording right now the webinar and we will move to the question.